As I've been getting ready for this morning, I've been reflecting on something that one of my professors loves to say. My professor, Adam Hurlson, says that the oldest story in the world, the deepest, most human story, goes like this. I left home, I saw some things, then I came back home, and home was different. My most recent version of the story goes like this. I was having this conversation with a guy who is a member of my wife's congregation. My wife, Sandra, is a minister in the United Church of Christ. And I was at this potluck at Sandra's church and talking to this guy, and he told me that in his spare time, he does Revolutionary War reenactments. And I said, I've always wanted to do that. To try it out. I don't know that I'm a every weekend, own my own musket kind of guy, but I said, I just thought it'd be cool to, put on the stuff and see what it's like. And, especially since I'm looking pretty seriously at this move south and, was making this list in my head of the New England things I want to do. And he said, well, in just a few weeks, he and his group are going to be reenacting the Sudbury, Massachusetts regiment's role in the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and he invited me to join. And I said, sure. He didn't tell me at the time that this particular event in the American Revolution that we would be portraying happened to consist mostly of an 11-mile march, or that this march began at 4 a.m. But I'd already said yes and borrowed a costume, so there was no going back. So on that morning, I showed up outside the church where this march had started at 4 a.m. in my borrowed 18th century costume, bleary-eyed and as of yet unaware that I had put my 18th century pants on backwards. And we gathered around a campfire outside of this church and, standing around in our colonial garb and talking to these little kids whose parents had brought them out to see us in the middle of the night. And the first thing that happened was that the marching orders were read. This guy got up and said, "My fellow patriots, there has been a battle at Lexington and Concord, and 8 of our fellow patriots have been slain." And everyone went, boo. And then something amazing happened. They called the roll. Everybody had gotten this little piece of paper with the name of one of the soldiers who had done this actual march in the year 1775. And, the guy who was playing the colonel read out the list of names, and we all had to shout present when our guy's name was called. And this struck me as such an amazingly sacred thing. All of us standing around and listening to the names of these men who had stood on this spot hundreds of years before. These men, none of whom had accomplished anything so particularly significant that their names were still known outside of this town, and still here we were, huddled together reading their names at 4 a.m. And then as we were getting ready to start the march, they told me that my honor as the newcomer was that I got to carry the banner, which was this big wooden flagpole that, they strap to your chest in this leather thing. It's kind of like a baby Bjorn. And then we started marching, and as far as 11-mile marches that begin at 4 a.m. carrying a flag, wearing historically accurate shoes go, this one wasn't bad. There was coffee and protein bars and fife music, and 7 hours and 11 miles later, we finally arrived at the place where the Battle of Lexington and Concord happened, and there were a few people there. But not what I'd been expecting. There was no crowd, and there was definitely nobody there dressed like the British Army ready to pretend to shoot at us. So I asked the guy who had invited me, where is everybody? And he said, well, historically, by the time the Sudbury Regiment actually got there, the battle was mostly over. I mean, they fired off a couple shots, kind of just to say that they did, but they mostly just turned around and went home. So we had just marched 11 miles at 4 a.m. to reenact a bunch of guys who marched 11 miles at 4 a.m. That is the most quintessentially Boston thing that has ever happened. We weren't on our way to the reenactment. We had been doing the reenactment the entire time, and everybody said, "You didn't know that?" And I said, honestly, if it happened before the start of Hamilton, the Broadway musical, I'm lost. But on the trip back, which happened blessedly in a car, and which took about 15 minutes, I kept thinking about this kid, whatever kid had carried the real banner when this event had actually happened, right? This kid whose name I couldn't find, this kid who was probably about half my age. And I wondered if his first reaction might have been similar to mine, right? Like, are you seriously telling me that I just got up super early and marched all this way and now there's nothing to do but turn around and go home? Or if he was relieved just to have gone and not had to participate in a more serious conflict. I kept thinking about his life before that march and then his life on that day, April 19th, 1775, where he had just seen the tail end of a violent conflict, and then about his life after. I wondered what he did next. And I kept thinking about these people that I'd been marching with, these natives of Sudbury, Massachusetts, who year after year get together to reenact one of the most underwhelming moments in the American Revolution, not for the excitement of it, but because it is a piece of their story. It is a piece of who they are that they keep coming back to and honoring year after year. These people who are willing to pick up these muskets and flags and make this long march to connect with their history, no matter how unimportant that history may seem to other people. It is still a part of who they are, and they honor it, and they carry it. They honor these people that acted out the oldest human story, these people who left home, who saw some things, and then came home to a different place. And this brings us to our prodigal son. This is one of the most often preached stories in the New Testament. This is a parable that Jesus tells, but we're going to kind of intercept and take it a different way today. I should also say, now I know this is UU Church, and we don't always read the Bible in UU Church, but I like to talk about and preach out of the Bible, because whether you view the Bible as a sacred text or as just a very old book that is very sacred to a lot of people, it is a part of who we are. It is a part of our story as Unitarian-Universalists, and people who have used it to cause harm do not own it. They do not have any more right to it than we do, and what we say it means isn't any more or less valid than what anybody else says that it means. So I like to take it out and see where it can go. So the prodigal son. We have this kid who is living on his parents' very successful farm, who decides that he wants all of his inheritance now and proceeds to go off and party it all away. I went to college with a lot of these kids. And then, having blown his inheritance and having decided that feeding pigs isn't quite for him, he returns home and is greeted by his father, who is overjoyed to see him and throws him a big party. And then his brother has a not entirely unwarranted tantrum that he presumably gets over, and everyone is happy. But I think about this kid, the prodigal son, how he, like the kid who carried the banner from Sudbury to Concord 240 years ago, he left home. He saw some things. And then he came home, and home was different. And not just because he got a huge party thrown for him, and, almost everybody was happy to see him, but the next day as well. He gets home, and home is different because he is different. This is what we human beings do. We change, we grow, and we shrink. And the way in which we see the world in which we live and the home in which we live changes and grows and shrinks with us. And as we change, the way we relate to the world changes. And this process carries some loss with it. This process can be hard, but what is helpful to me at least is to remember that home is not a static thing. Home is not one thing that can only be one way. It helps to think of home as a process. Home as something that we build together constantly, that is never the same as it was a moment or an instant ago. Home is a story that we tell each other and ourselves. Like in the Midrash that was our children's message today, home is a project that we create together, a project on which we are all partners. These guys in Sudbury who invited me to march with them were telling the story of their home as it was. We were dressed up the way that people back then would have looked. We were reading their names aloud, invoking their presence, walking the same path that they walked, and still we were walking through a different place. A place where the rules are different. A place where the guy carrying the banner realized he needed to reschedule a meeting and had to run behind a barn to grab out his iPhone. A place that was different because of the impact that they had had on it, because of the work that they had done on it over time. And what about the prodigal son's home? Something I always think about with this story is, so what happens next? Because these two brothers are now stuck with each other, and they're eventually going to have to learn to deal with and forgive each other. You know, I've always been a little more sympathetic to the older brother. You know, it's this dude. Why does this guy get special treatment? He's been off partying, and I'm the one who's been responsible. But I think we can extend a little bit of sympathy, too, for the younger brother. He says, nice to see you, too. And I think of them eventually running into each other the next day or the next week after the younger brother's return and kind of not having an excuse and kind of saying, hey, and kind of standing there, and then eventually the older brother says, so, how was it? And they talk, and they learn. And then the younger brother says, so, what happened while I was gone? And they talk more, and they learn more, and then home is different again. And I think about the kid from Sudbury who carried the banner to Concord, the kid who I reenacted, who got home, and his home was different. And somebody, maybe his parents or his friends, said, so, what happened? And he told the story. He told the oldest story that anybody has ever told. I left home. I saw some things. Then I came home, and home was different. And then, there's all of us, right? Here we all are trying to start out this week that we spend getting to know each other and trying to figure out what it means for Church of the River in Memphis, Tennessee, to be a home for all of us. The good people seated in this room and some scrappy 29-year-old punk kid from Boston who didn't know what dry rub barbecue was until the search committee explained it to him. It involves a lot of adjustment for everybody. It involves all of us coming in from our journey and seeing what does home look like now. One of the stories I love to tell is when I was working at First Church in Boston, there was this armchair that I really liked. I know there is so much Boston history in this sermon. You guys are doing so great. We're gonna end in Memphis. I'm just hang on. So at First Church in Boston, there's this chair. And during staff meetings in the parlor, which was this very fancy room, I like to sit in this chair. It was a good chair. It had, this high back and carved wooden armrests, and someone pointed out to me that this chair that I was rather fond of had its own history. It had once belonged to one of First Church in Boston's earliest ministers, the famed Puritan theologian Cotton Mather, whose work I had been assigned in seminary and skimmed. And it was mind-blowing just to think of how horrified Cotton Mather, the Puritan, would have been to see me working at his church, standing behind his pulpit, sitting in his special chair. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cotton Mather, this guy could Puritan with the best of them. When I was there with my tattoos, wearing my high tops to work, and for goodness sake, I'm half Jewish. And this is how Cotton Mather's home eventually became different, continued becoming different long after he had left it. It became a place where somebody like me was allowed. And I had the story somewhere in my search materials. And then on my last day in Memphis, when I was here as a pre-candidate, Ellen and Ron from the search committee took me out to Arcade Restaurant. And I got to sit down in the booth on the very seat even where Elvis had once sat. And Ellen leaned in and said, "So how does it feel?" I said, "It feels good." She said, "Is it better than Cotton Mather's armchair?" And I said, "Yeah." And then it was my turn to go home and see that things were different. So we try here to make this church a home that will never be the same as it was, a home that will never be the same as it was a month ago, or a year ago, or a decade ago, or just now. And not just because of a new minister, though undeniably a new minister is a huge change, but also because we all take the experiences that we have had, the 4 a.m. marches that each of us have done, the places we have been, the things we have seen, the mistakes we have made, the inheritances we have mishandled, the brothers that we have infuriated, and the fathers who we have convinced to forgive us, the chairs of important people in which we have sat. We take these things and we bring them here, and we all change this place. We create it together, in partnership together. Every day, every moment, we come together here, and then we leave, and we see things. And then we come back, and we tell each other what we saw. And we create this home together again, Sunday after Sunday, week after week, year after year, and off into a future that will never be the same. Amen.